Here's a question. Why does a League of Legends history matter? This is a question you could totally ask me because I have been spending the greater portion of the preseason making a bunch of videos and series on certain elements to do with League's early history. We've talked a lot about early pro players and streamers like Hotshot GG, Chu Aid, Guardsman Bob. We've talked about a lot of strategies and champions from League's early days, stuff like Nidalee top lane, Rengar top lane, and Skarner top lane, and it's been pretty fun. I mean, I've been having a lot of enjoyment doing it myself. I always love talking about history, and it seems like you guys are enjoying the videos as well. But there is something to be said for, why is this important? League is a video game. What real benefit is there beyond the entertainment factor of learning about the history of the early days of League? And I thought that might be a fun little thing to explore in a vlog today, so that is exactly what we're going to do. Now, let's start off by talking about why actual history matters, which I know you guys, every one of my viewers is a smart person. I'm sure you all know why it is that history is one of the 4 core subjects in school, the other being language, others being language, mathematics, as well as science. But history / social studies, or whatever it is you want to call it, has always been my favorite class in school because there's so much interesting stuff going on and quite a bit that can be fairly useful to you as well when it comes to your day-to-day life and just general knowledge that is pretty much worth having. So essentially, I would say you could break it down into maybe 2 different categories of what makes history worth learning about. The first of which is history can teach you quite a bit of lessons and give you a bit of an understanding of how the world came to be the way it is today. And there's that famous quote, "Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it." And that's one of the driving forces behind a lot of the stuff that you will learn in a history class. Like, for instance, I'm obviously speaking from the American education system, growing up in America. There are some things that you will learn in American elementary school and high school that probably aren't super useful to every individual. Like, I would say it's pretty important that you understand the founding of our country as well as, the founding fathers and everything that happened during our nation's birth. But at the same time, I could see an argument that not everybody needs to know, not everybody needs to name every president or know everything that every president has done. And you could totally make an argument that people that don't go into politics and law and that kind of, those sorts of fields, it's not imperative for them to be able to understand that kind of stuff the way that it's kind of imperative for them to be able to speak, to know basic grammar, read and write, and know math and other things that you might learn in school. But that being said, there are some really important subjects that are taught in school in history and social studies classes that are pretty important for everybody to know. And typically, there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from history, some of which are very important. Maybe the best example of this is Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and World War II. This is something that I've actually seen some goofballs, some right-wing goofballs especially, who will go and say like, why do we learn so much about the Holocaust? Why don't we learn about the Armenian genocide or Mao Zedong or Soviet Russia? Or, they kind of say, why don't we teach the evils of communism the same way we teach the evils of fascism? Which, I don't want to get too political, obviously, but there is a reason why you spend so much of your history classes on Nazi Germany. Which, again, I don't know that much about other education systems around the world, but in America, there are years and years and years that you devote to the Holocaust and World War II and Nazi Germany. And the reason is, as sad as it is, we don't typically... most human beings kind of come to an understanding that there's always going to be awful things happening in the world, and we're not going to be able to do everything about every individual crisis. Even just today, there's all sorts of horrible things. That the Middle East has been a mess my entire lifetime, and beyond that, there are horrifying things happening. The Turks are bombing the Kurds. There's man-made famines in Africa. There's concentration camps in North Korea and China. North Korea is a nightmare to live in, the Hermit Kingdom. And there's even that whole thing with, I think it's like Muslims who are being exiled from Myanmar on the Myanmar and India border. It'll always be Burma to me. But anyway, point being, this isn't something to laugh about. There's horrifying things that are happening all over the world, but we kind of come to an understanding that oftentimes the reason that we don't really seemingly care as much is because it's tough to expect every corner of the world to be just, as developed as our own nations, when a lot of people don't even have basic utilities and basic necessities. I mean, if you have to walk 20 miles just to be able to get fresh water, then how are you going to expect someone like that to be able to live in a free and open society with democracy and free elections and everything? I mean, you're bound to see corruption and all sorts of evils in some of those areas of the world that still have so many basic necessities that have not been met yet. However, the thing that was really scary and kind of awful about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust was that was a developed nation. I mean, Nazi Germany, or Germany post-World War I, they certainly had reparations and all sorts of things that maybe, it's not like they were living in the exact same societies we live in nowadays, but I mean, they were a developed nation in Central Europe, the same as all the other, Central European nations, not much different from the US or the UK. They had elections and everything, but in spite of the fact that it was a developed nation, and in spite of the fact that it was a first world country, same as any other, you still saw this horrifying thing happen where, this incredibly evil dictator ended up as the head of the government and perpetrated the Holocaust, and millions of Jews obviously had their lives completely destroyed, as millions more lives beyond beyond them were also affected in unspeakable ways with, the ensuing world war that started. And to see that happen in a developed nation is such a terrifying thing. It's worth learning about because, you want to learn about those sorts of lessons, that it's not just other, tribal villages in far off corners of the world that can see awful things happen. But, even in the modern society that we see as civilized, even here, terrifying things can occur. Very depressing start to this video. The other thing that's kind of interesting about history, though, that I think is really fun when it comes to learning about various things that have occurred, is that history is something that's really enjoyable because it kind of connects you to the human experience in a way that maybe literature does, but not many other things you will learn in school. So I'll give you my favorite example. One of my favorite literary works and one of my favorite books is The Canterbury Tales, which of course was written in, I think it was like 1380 to 1400 by Geoffrey Chaucer. That was like 100 years before Shakespeare. But if you've read The Canterbury Tales, which most people are in English classes, it's so fun because you get to see, these are people that lived more than half a millennia ago, and they still deal with the exact same things that we do. I mean, there are still hilarious jokes and all sorts of fun things that are told in those tales that are very relatable to people of the modern day. I mean, maybe one of my favorite tales is it the Wife of Bath, the Wife of Bath's tale, where she tells the tale of a man is convicted of rape and then is sentenced to death. But then the queen says that he can that he can stave his execution. He can prevent it if he can go and learn what it is that women really want. And then so he goes off and he tries to travel the world and find out what it is that women really want. And he's struggling. He can't do it to save his life, literally. And he eventually ends up coming across an old crone, an old ugly crone, who then tells him what women really want is to be in charge, is to have a voice and be in charge of their husband and everything. And then he goes back to the queen and tells her that, which of course is correct. So he is spared, and then he marries the old crone out of gratitude. But then after time goes on, he ends up becoming a little bit depressed. The old lady asks him why he's so upset, and then he says, "Well, it's because I have such an ugly wife, and that's my life now." So she says to him, she offers him a deal where she says, "Well, I will change myself into a beautiful young woman that you can be proud to call your wife if you so wish. But if I were to do that, then I will no longer be faithful to you." And then he ends up, she asks him, what choice do you want? He ends up saying that You know what? You can decide whatever it is that you think is best. And then, of course, that is the true right answer, because he then understands what women really want is to be able to have a voice and be in charge. And then so because of that, she ends up turning beautiful and staying faithful to him. And that's like such a fun story. Oh, I love that. I love that, I'm sure 99% of my audience is male, and I'm sure plenty of you guys have had difficulty understanding how it is to properly treat women, or not how to treat women. I hope you understand how to treat women with respect, but when it comes to courting them and understanding what it is that makes them happy, it's something that, you struggle with so much when you're a teenager and young adult. And to see even people from the 1300s, having those sorts of problems and issues, and being able to relate to people from such a long period ago, that is such an enjoyable thing and such an enjoyable experience, which, that's just as much literature as it is history. But, the Canterbury Tales, what they really were, they were 24 different individual stories that all had to do with what life was like in medieval times, where when you read the tales, all of the people that had noble professions, the knight's tale or the squire's tale, and like all these people that were high up in society as royalty or members of the clergy, they were all telling tales of these noble feats, all these various kind of typical fairy tale things that you would expect that had to do with honor and duty and dignity. But then when all of the individuals in society who were much lower, the serfs and the peasants and the people who were seen as much lower in society, they were telling much raunchier tales about sexual deviancy and trickery and all these things that are filled with humor that people would probably love even today. And I think that's one of the most powerful and enjoyable things about history, is being able to go and relate in various ways to the human experience beyond just, what you experience today. Being able to look back and make connections to the modern era, connecting the Roman Empire to how governments are structured today, or going and understanding early language and various things throughout history, and then seeing how that formed and shaped the world into what it is today, and being able to connect to those people of the past, I think is something that's very, very fun. And there also, I should also probably mention, there's also an element of, I think it's really cool how truth is often stranger than fiction. When you go and learn about the various cool, maybe like pop history stories that you can, learning about stuff like the war that Australia tried to fight against emus and then lost, or, the war between the Finns and Soviet Russia, where Finland was completely outmatched, but then they ended up completely destroying the Soviets. Or, even just basic little things like that one Soviet doctor who performed an appendectomy on himself. There's a lot of really fun and cool parts of history that, if you were to read them in a book, you would think, oh, that is completely unrealistic. But the fact that they actually happened, that's why we consistently see movie makers and storytellers consistently readapting history, in various things as recent as The Revenant. That movie, The Revenant, with Leonardo DiCaprio, that was really cool. Not because it was a particularly interesting story, but because it actually happened. That's the coolest part about learning about history. Anyway, though, we've been going on for quite a bit on why history matters, which I hope you all already knew anyway. But why is it that League of Legends history matters? Why is it that League of Legends history has anything to do with anything? You could certainly say that League of Legends history doesn't have nearly as much to do, or doesn't have nearly as much importance as actual history, which I would agree with you. League of Legends history does not have as much importance when it comes to learning about that compared to learning about World War II, or learning about the Holocaust, or learning about, all the atrocities that have occurred over the years. However, I do think that there is still something to be said for learning about League history. Because at the end of the day, most things don't matter, right? Most things, sure, League history isn't as important as actual history, but all entertainment is not as important as basic necessities. Most of the things that we do in daily life are not nearly as important as some of those kind of huge groundbreaking things. but they are still worth learning about, and I would say for maybe a couple different reasons, but essentially for the same reasons as it's worth learning about actual history. So, for example, I do think that you probably can learn quite a few lessons when it comes to League of Legends and learning about that history in the same sort of way that you can learn lessons from actual history. So, for example, the tank meta. If Riot ends up putting us into another tank meta, I'm going to know exactly what to do. I'm going to know exactly what tanks to play and how to play them to, be able to climb in rating and everything. I'm going to know exactly what champions to play and how to play them to counter the tanks and beat them. And the reason for it is because I've spent so much time studying that awful tank meta that we had for like 5 seasons or whatever it was, playing in it myself, but also just, figuring out what it is that caused it, why it was here, why it stayed for so long, and the decisions and everything that Riot made to put us in that position. I'm not an expert. I'm not like, Challenger or anything. But I've spent enough time paying attention to all these various different things that I can understand, what it is that put us there and why we were there for so long, so that I can recognize it if it happens again and know what to do. And that sort of being able to recognize patterns and decisions from League's history and then apply it to the modern era, the modern era in various ways, so that you can climb in rating or that you can, do whatever it is you want to do. I think that is something that should be said. But at the end of the day, it really is more about the entertainment factor and kind of that truth is stranger than fiction mantra, where, there's probably something to be said for, it's important to understand history in various entertainment mediums so that you can be cultured and educated in them. So, for example, if you want to really be seriously considered as someone that has a valuable opinion when it comes to movies, when it comes to film, it's kind of important for you to watch The Godfather. It's kind of important for you to know who Buster Keaton was and to see Citizen Kane, or to see even like Star Wars or Annie Hall or Primer. I mean, seeing movies like that are considered classics or landmark movies through in particular mediums or particular ways, that's something that's fairly important to be able to understand. Like Eraserhead is a very weird movie that you might not like, but if you want to be able to understand surrealism as an art medium, it's kind of important for you to see it, because that was such a big landmark thing in the surrealist movement. Same deal with the movie Primer, which is on Netflix, by the way. You should go watch it if you haven't seen it already. Primer is the best indie movie that's probably ever been made. Not because it's the best movie of all time, but because it is one of the best movies that has been made, and it had a budget of $5,000. It had a budget that was so minuscule that most people could have paid for it. Most people in society probably have savings of that or something, or they could take out a loan for $5,000 to make a movie. But in spite of the fact that it had this minuscule budget, it ended up being this incredible movie, not just in the filmmaking and everything, but in the storytelling techniques and in some of the inventive ways that I don't want to spoil anything, but in some of the inventive things that it did with its subject material, it ended up turning into this gigantic landmark thing that if you want to be able to say that you're educated and that your opinion kind of has weight behind it when talking about movies, and particularly indie movies, you should probably watch Primer or have a kind of a good understanding of it, because it's kind of the greatest indie movie of all time. And that's kind of important to be able to, it really comes down to just being able to understand what it is that you're doing. Same deal with basketball. If you're watching basketball and consider yourself a basketball aficionado, it's kind of important for you to understand the history of the game, because if you just want to say that LeBron James is the greatest player of all time, that statement has no weight behind it if you're an 8-year-old that's saying that, and the only basketball you've ever watched are Lakers games in the modern era. If you just started watching basketball this year and you say LeBron James is the greatest player of all time, that might say something, that he's better than all the other players that are playing in the NBA right now, but that doesn't say nearly as much as if you are a seasoned basketball veteran who knows or has personally watched Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Oscar Robertson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, like all the various legends of basketball, if you understand how great those players were, what they were able to do in their eras, and then you go and say LeBron James is the greatest player of all time, then that has a much bigger weight put behind it. You have much more validity to make that argument, or to make whatever criticisms or comments you may wish to make. And I think that's something that's totally worth doing. If you really want to devote yourself to a hobby or to an interest and a passion, whether it be something that's not super important like basic entertainment, you should still be fairly educated and understanding of the history behind it. And that's kind of what I think is important with League of Legends. League of Legends, you can take lessons and use it to climb, but if you're not someone, maybe you're not someone that plays League of Legends anymore, you just watch, content on YouTube and maybe LCS, LCK or something. If that's the case, it's kind of important for you to be able to understand the history of the game, because not only will you have much more weight in your comments that you may make about the game, but it's also something that will make you appreciate things way more. If you just watch LCS and all you know about it is what you see this year, then sure, you might be able to see like, oh, this guy's good, this guy's bad, this team is awesome, this team is garbage. But that doesn't really give you nearly as much enjoyment and as much to as much to dissect and pay attention to and research and understand, compared to if you were to say, wow, this top laner is amazing because not only is he playing very well right now, but him put in context of all the different great top laners that were before him, he's doing something new, something interesting, something crazy, maybe something we haven't seen for 3 or 4 years. And to see that with the context of everything that came before him is so exciting. And I think that's the thing that's really important, of being able to understand what you're watching when it comes to modern League of Legends and paying attention to the modern game. And also, at the end of the day, too, there's something to be said for how awesome it is, League's history. Like, the history of League of Legends is something that is so entertaining in a way that we have not seen with most other things. Like, the revolution of League becoming a big thing, League really pushed esports in a completely new direction. And it's crazy to think about like what ended up happening, right? Because so for example, you had early League players like Hotshot GG or Reginald or Liquid 112 who ended up becoming millionaires. I don't know that much about all the individuals per se, but we know Reginald as the owner, the founder, the builder of TSM, Team Solo Mid, which is now turned into this multi-million-dollar organization. He has got to be swimming in money, right? I mean, Hotshot GG sold a majority stake of CLG to the Madison Square Garden company to get into LCS and pay the, 10 million or whatever fee there was to buy an LCS spot. That is insane to think that these kids, who were just kids at the time, they were 20 years old or whatever, they had a career and now they're retired at 28. It's crazy to think about. These guys are multimillionaires now. And the story of how they went from just nerdy kids that really liked video games to suddenly being multimillionaires who are retired and don't have to work another day in their life for the rest of their lives, which is still quite a while. That story is so interesting, especially when you contrast it to some of the other players out there. I mean, there are some other players that didn't end up doing all that much. Like, Chowster, I think, is a CPA right now, a certified public accountant. He was incredibly influential, an incredibly influential member of the early CLG days, where he was not only an amazing player himself, but he also was, there's all those memes about him being the smartest player and kind of teaching Doublelift how to even play League of Legends, doing all these various different things. And he had this one early, exciting, bright, and shining moment. He traveled the world, competed in all these tournaments, and won some money. And then, he just went back to a normal life afterwards. He just went back, got his degree. He's a CPA now, and just went back to being a normal dude. And that's really interesting, too, that not only are there some people who just kind of went from nothing to multimillionaires, but there are also these really interesting stories, I think, of these kids who ended up going They had this really exciting, bright, shining moment in their youth, and then they went down the traditional path of going to college and getting a regular job, and they will always have this very exciting moment in their history, their own personal history, where they were the kings of the world. That is so cool. That is so awesome. And there's so many different stories that I could go on for another 5 hours here just talking about, the St. Viciouses and the Lapacas and the Sidcos and the Elementses and the Big Fat Gigis and all, Chaox and Rain Man and all these different people, and seeing these players who were able to really shape. These guys are the reason that League of Legends is the way it is today. These guys are the reason the pro scene is the way it is, the reason the meta is the way it is, the reason that Riot does the things that they do, the reason the Balance team does the things that they do, although don't hold that against them. They are why everything is the way it is today. And it's so cool, I think, to go and look at all these different stories, because it's just the best, dude. I'm having a lot of fun making these videos, and I hope that you guys continue watching them, because there is so much to tell still, and so many different stories that we can still explore. I think that at the end of the day, these stories are just really fun to pay attention to, and they're really fun for me to tell. I hope they're fun for you to listen to, and I'm going to have a lot of enjoyment continuing to do them, because it's really crazy that they're all true. It isn't just me telling a story about some young kid who ended up becoming a millionaire through gaming. It's stuff that has all actually happened and shaped the game that we now play today. It's kind of shaped the esports world. It's kind of sad, honestly, to think about, because some of these superstars from the early days, if they were playing today, they would be the ones that are getting the $3 million a year salaries, the huge contracts to play for pro teams. They were just a little bit early. And by the time all this big stuff ended up coming around, they were, they kind of retired. They left the game. They got a little bit old and had to leave. But I mean, just because they didn't end up making the big bucks the way the superstars nowadays do, that doesn't mean that their stories aren't worth telling. And I've obviously had a lot of fun with some of the documentaries we've made. I've had a lot of fun exploring the gameplay stuff we've done recently. And I hope you guys are looking forward to more, because we got a lot more coming. So I will see you all in that next video, whenever it ends up being. But until then, thank you very much for watching. Good luck in solo queue, and have a wonderful day.